Under the iron fist of Dwayne Andreas, the Andreas family ruled American agriculture like a feudal monarchy, where loyalty was the only law. From their fortress in Decatur, they controlled the global food supply and paved the way to the throne for the heir apparent, Mick Andreas. Yet, this dynasty crumbled the moment they unknowingly nurtured a destroyer within their own inner sanctum. Mark Whitaker, the man the Andreas family embraced as an adopted son, repaid their benevolence with hidden wires and catastrophic betrayal. He single-handedly decapitated the succession, sent his sworn brother Mick to federal prison, and dragged two families into an abyss of tragedy, burying a glorious legacy beneath the ashes of lies and madness. Inside the Andreas family's multi-billion-dollar kingdom of fear, by the 1970s, Archer Daniels Midland, ADM, had ceased to function as a normal corporation. It had evolved into the private fortified kingdom of Dwayne Andreas. Standing just 5'4", Andreas was a man of Napoleonic ambition and lethal charm, a Mennonite farm boy from Iowa who had transformed himself into the soybean king of the world. He did not rule ADM from a glass skyscraper in New York or London. He ruled it from a concrete fortress in Decatur, Illinois, a gritty, flat industrial town that smelled perpetually of processing corn and money. Dwayne Andreas was the patriarch of a dynasty built on a singular, terrifyingly simple philosophy that he preached like a gospel to his subordinates. The competitor is our friend, and the customer is our enemy. This mantra was the moral code he drilled into his family. Dwayne believed that the free market was a myth for suckers. True power, he taught, came from consolidation, from the quiet handshake in a hotel room that fixed the price of bread for the entire planet. He operated in the gray zones of global power. A man who could fly to Moscow, to meet with Mikhail Gorbachev, or to Washington to hand a bag of cash to Richard Nixon, a literal event during the Watergate scandal that nearly derailed his career but ultimately only hardened his cynicism. He believed he was above the law because he fed the world. The primary victim of this worldview was not the American consumer. It was his own son, Michael Mick Andreas. Born in 1949, Mick was the Prince of Decatur. From the moment he could walk, he was groomed to inherit the throne. But this was not a nurturing upbringing. It was an indoctrination. Dwayne Andreas did not raise a son. He constructed a successor. Mick was raised in the shadow of a father who was friends with Hubert Humphrey and Bob Dole, a father who treated laws as suggestions and ethics as obstacles. Mick grew up in a world where right and wrong were defined solely by what was good for ADM. He watched his father manipulate markets, buy politicians, and crush dissent. He learned that loyalty to the family business superseded loyalty to the country or the law. By the 1980s, Mick Andreas had ascended to the role of vice chairman. He was the operational brain to his father's political muscle. But friends and observers noted a darkness in Mick. He was capable, but he was cold, mirroring the ruthless pragmatism of his father. He lacked his father's charm, but possessed his father's arrogance. The father and son ruled ADM with an air of absolute invincibility. They tapped phones within the company. They hired private investigators to stalk critics. They created a culture of omerta, silence in Decatur, that rivaled the mafia families of New York. In the Andreas household, the greatest sin was not crime, it was disloyalty. Executives who questioned the methods were exiled. Those who played the game were rewarded with riches beyond their dreams. This insular, paranoid world was the only reality Mick Andreas ever knew. He was trapped in a golden cage of corn syrup and ethanol, surrounded by yes-men who laughed at his jokes and feared his father's wrath. The dynasty seemed secure. They controlled the harvest. They controlled the politicians. They controlled the price. The succession plan was set. Dwayne would rule until he couldn't, and then Mick would take the crown. But the insularity of Decatur bred a fatal blindness. The Andreas family believed they were untouchable because in Decatur they were kings. They forgot that outside the city limits, the FBI and the Department of Justice viewed them differently. They forgot that in the real world, fixing prices was a felony, not a business strategy. And in the late 1980s, as the company looked to expand into the high-tech world of biotech and food additives, the dynasty made a fatal error. They realized that Mick, for all his loyalty, lacked the scientific brilliance to lead the company into the next century. They needed new blood. They needed a scientist. They decided to open the gates of their fortress to an outsider. They were looking for a tool, a technician they could control. Instead, they invited in a virus. In 1989, Mark Whitaker drove on to the ADM campus in Decatur, and the chemistry of the dynasty changed forever. He was 32 years old, a brilliant Cornell-educated biochemist with a cherubic face, a high-pitched voice, and an eagerness to please that bordered on the desperate. He had been hired away from a German chemical firm to run ADM's new bioproducts division. To Dwayne Andreas, Whitaker was not just an employee, he was a revelation. He was the golden boy, the scientific visionary that his own son Mick could never be. Dwayne seduced Whitaker with the overwhelming force of his personality and his checkbook. He didn't just give him a job, he gave him a life. He gave Whitaker the keys to the corporate fleet of Falcon jets. He moved him into a sprawling mansion near the country club. He invited him to dinner at his own home, bypassing the rigid hierarchy that kept other executives at bay. He famously told the young scientist, "I want you to be a billionaire." For Mick Andreas, the biological heir, this was a dangerous intrusion. He watched from his office as his father fawned over the newcomer. But Mick was a pragmatist. He realized that Whitaker was useful. ADM had just bet the future of the company on a massive billion-dollar gamble, lysine. Lysine is an amino acid derived from corn, used as a feed additive to make chickens and pigs grow fatter, faster. ADM had built the world's largest lysine factory in the middle of the Illinois cornfields, intending to crush the Japanese and Korean companies that dominated the market. Whitaker was the scientist hired to make the factory work, but by 1991, the factory was failing. A terrifying bacteria was eating the product in the fermentation tanks. The golden boy was failing to deliver. The pressure from the boardroom was crushing. Dwayne Andreas demanded results. Mick Andreas demanded profit. It was in this crucible of stress that the corruption of Mark Whitaker began. It was not a sudden fall. It was a slow, guided descent. Mick Andreas began to teach the Boy Scout the real rules of the Andreas family business. He explained that when you cannot win by technology, you win by arrangement. In late 1991 and early 1992, Mick Andreas initiated Whitaker into the inner circle. He explained that the Japanese competitors, companies like Ajinomoto and Kyowa Hakko, were bleeding money just like ADM because of the price war. The solution, Mick explained with the casual demeanor of a man ordering lunch, was not to compete, but to cooperate. They needed to stabilize the market. They needed to fix the price. Whitaker was shocked, but he was also seduced. He wanted to be an Andreas man. He wanted to save his division. So he agreed. He became the emissary of the cartel. He traveled to Tokyo and Mexico City, meeting with the Asian executives, using his scientific credentials to mask the criminal intent of the meetings. But as Whitaker stepped into the criminal underworld of price fixing, something fractured in his own mind, unbeknownst to the Andreas family. Their golden boy was suffering from severe undiagnosed bipolar disorder. The stress of the failing factory, combined with the thrill of the illegal conspiracy, triggered a manic episode that would last for years. Whitaker began to hallucinate a reality where he was not just an employee, but a titan equal to Dwayne Andreas. And if he was a titan, he deserved a titan's wealth. He felt that his salary, though high, was insufficient for the risks he was taking. He felt entitled. In 1992, while he was helping Mick Andreas rob the world's food supply through price fixing, Mark Whitaker began to rob ADM. He invented a phantom. He created a network of shell companies in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands with names like Nord Biochem. He devised a scheme involving fake invoices for consulting services and technology transfers. He would sign checks from ADM to these fake vendors, and the money would circle the globe and land in his personal bank account. It was a breathtaking double life. By day, he was the dutiful executive, sitting at Dwayne Andreas's right hand, plotting global domination. By night, he was a manic thief, siphoning millions of dollars to buy sports cars, horse stables, and luxury estate expansions. He told his wife, Ginger, that the money was a secret bonus from the Andreas family, a reward for his loyalty. The Andreas dynasty had created a monster. They had taken a brilliant, unstable man, fed his ego, taught him that laws were irrelevant, and placed him in a pressure cooker of high-stakes crime. They believed they controlled him. They believed he was their creature. They did not realize that the man they had invited into their fortress was mentally disintegrating, and that his chaotic unraveling would soon bring the FBI to their doorstep. The supermarket to the world was now a crime scene, and the mole was already inside the boardroom. From corporate executive to FBI spy 007. By early 1992, the Archer-Daniels Midland Empire was facing a billion-dollar problem that could not be solved by engineering or chemistry. The company had constructed the largest lysine factory in the world in Decatur, Illinois, a sprawling industrial cathedral of pipes and fermentation tanks designed to crush the global competition. Lysine, an amino acid derived from corn, was a miracle powder for industrial farming. When sprinkled into the feed of chickens and pigs, it made them grow faster, leaner, and cheaper. ADM's plan was simple: flood the market with American lysine, drive the price down, and bankrupt the entrenched Japanese and Korean producers who had dominated the industry for decades. But the plan had backfired. The Japanese giants Ajinomoto and Kiyohako did not fold. Instead, they fought back, matching ADM's price cuts dollar for dollar. The result was a brutal war of attrition. The price of lysine plummeted from over $1.30 a pound to under 70 cents. ADM was bleeding money. The supermarket to the world was selling its newest product at a loss. In the executive suite in Decatur, Mick Andreas, the heir apparent, decided that the war had gone on long enough. He was a disciple of his father's philosophy that competition was for losers. He summoned his top lieutenant, Terry Wilson, the head of the corn processing division, and his new golden boy, Mark Whitaker, the head of the bioproducts division. The order was given not in a memo, but in a quiet conversation. It was time to stop fighting the Japanese and start talking to them. It was time to stabilize the market. The mechanism they created to facilitate this crime was a masterpiece of corporate camouflage. They formed an international trade group called the Lysine Manufacturers Association. On paper, the association existed to discuss technical issues, animal welfare, and regulatory standards. In reality, it was a front. The official agenda was a sham. The real business happened after the secretaries left the room. The first major summit of this new cartel took place in Mexico City in June 1992. The executives from ADM met with their counterparts from Ajinomoto and Kiowa Hakko in a luxury hotel suite. The atmosphere was tense. These were men who had spent years trying to destroy each other. But Mick Andreas broke the ice with the cold pragmatism of a mob boss. He explained the new reality. There was enough money for everyone, provided they stopped acting like competitors and started acting like partners. The deal they hammered out was elegantly illegal. They would not just fix the price, they would fix the volume. Mick Andreas understood that price was a function of supply. If every company produced as much as they could, the price would crash. So they agreed to carve up the world map like a pizza. They assigned a specific quota to each company. ADM would get roughly 30% of the global market growth. Ajinomoto would get a share, Kiowa Hakko would get a share, and the Korean producer Sewon would get the scraps. If any company sold more than their allotted quota, they would be forced to buy the excess from their competitors at a penalty rate. It was a self-enforcing mechanism designed to keep supply low and prices high. This agreement transformed the lysine market overnight. The price of the additive began to climb, ticking up from 70 cents to 80 cents, then crossing the dollar mark. The chicken farmers in Arkansas and the pork producers in Iowa had no idea why their costs were rising. They assumed it was inflation or a bad corn harvest. In reality, it was a group of men in suits sitting in a hotel room deciding exactly how much profit they wanted to make that quarter. Mark Whitaker sat at the table during these meetings, wide-eyed and adrenaline-fueled. For a man from a small town in Ohio, this was the pinnacle of power. He was sitting with the masters of the universe, deciding the cost of food for the entire planet. He watched Mick Andreas and Terry Wilson operate with a terrifying lack of conscience. They joked about the customers they were gouging. They referred to the buyers, the farmers and co-ops, not as partners, but as the enemy. The philosophy was summed up in a phrase that would later become legendary in the annals of corporate crime. During one of these sessions, listening to his competitors worry about customer complaints, a senior ADM executive leaned in and said, "The competitor is our friend and the customer is our enemy." For Whitaker, this was an epiphany. He realized that the rules of society did not apply to the Andreas family. They lived in a world where laws were merely suggestions and morality was a weakness. This realization fed directly into his own growing mania. If Mick Andreas could steal millions from the global economy through price fixing, why couldn't Mark Whitaker steal a few million from ADM for himself? As the cartel solidified throughout 1992, the meetings moved from Mexico City to Paris, Vancouver, and Tokyo. They became more sophisticated. To avoid detection, the executives used code names. They referred to the price-fixing discussions as Phase 2 of the agenda. They practiced destruction of evidence, shredding notes and ensuring that no paper trail left the hotel rooms. By the autumn of 1992, the fix was in. The cartel was functioning perfectly. ADM's bioproducts division was suddenly posting record profits. Dwayne Andreas was thrilled. Mick Andreas was secure in his succession. And Mark Whitaker was the hero of the company, the genius who had turned around the lysine business. But the pressure of the double life, hero by day, thief by night, and conspirator on the weekends, was fracturing Whitaker's mind. The bipolar disorder that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. He became hyperactive, paranoid, and grandiose. He believed he was untouchable. And in his manic state, he made a mistake. He invented a problem that didn't exist, a lie so elaborate and unnecessary that it would bring the FBI right to the front door of the fortress. By November 1992, Mark Whitaker was living on a razor's edge. His embezzlement scheme was fully operational, siphoning millions of dollars into his offshore accounts. But the stress of the deception was beginning to warp his judgment. In a moment of panicked improvisation, he told his boss, Mick Andreas, a fantastical lie. He claimed that the production problems at the lysine plant, which were actually due to biological contamination, were the result of industrial sabotage. He invented a story about a rival Japanese executive who had hired a mole inside the factory to poison the fermentation tanks with a virus. It was a delusional fabrication, born of his bipolar paranoia and his need to explain away the plant's failures without taking the blame. But Dwayne and Mick Andreas, who lived in a world of constant corporate warfare, believed him. They were furious. They decided to call in the authorities to catch the saboteur. They called the FBI. This was the moment the trap snapped shut, not on the imaginary saboteur, but on the Andreas dynasty itself. When FBI Special Agent Brian Shepard arrived at ADM headquarters to investigate the sabotage claim, he expected a routine case of corporate espionage. Instead, he found Mark Whitaker. Whitaker, terrified that the FBI investigation into the sabotage would accidentally uncover his own embezzlement, made a split-second decision that would change history. In a private conversation with Agent Shepard, Whitaker broke down. He confessed that the sabotage story was a lie. But then, to save himself, he offered up a much bigger fish. He told Shepard that the real crime at ADM wasn't sabotage, it was price fixing. He told the agent about the secret meetings in Mexico City and Paris. He told him about the quotas, the Phase 2 agenda, and the philosophy that the customer is our enemy. He offered to become a cooperating witness. The FBI was stunned. They had stumbled onto one of the largest antitrust conspiracies in American history. But they had a problem. They had no evidence other than the word of a man who had just admitted to lying about sabotage. They needed proof. They needed tapes. Agent Shepard made Whitaker an offer. Wear a wire. Record your bosses. Get us the evidence and we can help you. Whitaker agreed. In that moment, he transformed from a corporate executive into 007, at least in his own mind. He saw himself not as an informant, but as a secret agent, a hero who would take down the corrupt old guard and emerge as the new White Knight CEO of ADM. It was a fantasy that would fuel his manic energy for the next 3 years. In early 1993, the FBI outfitted Whitaker with a hidden recording device. It was a clunky, terrifying piece of technology for a novice spy, a Nagra recorder taped to his inner thigh, with wires running up his shirt to a microphone hidden in his tie or lapel. For the next 2.5 years, Mark Whitaker lived the most stressful double life imaginable. By day, he sat in the boardroom with Mick Andreas and Terry Wilson, discussing the illegal cartel. By night, he met with Agent Shepard in parking lots and safe houses to hand over the tapes. The recordings were gold. Whitaker captured Mick Andreas, instructing him on how to manipulate the Japanese competitors. He recorded Terry Wilson explaining the mechanics of the quota system. He recorded the competitor is our friend speech. He recorded the very soul of the conspiracy. But the strain was breaking him. Whitaker's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began to hallucinate that he was being followed by ADM security. He bought multiple cars and houses with his embezzled money, manic spending sprees that he justified as the perks of his secret agent status. He told his wife, Ginger, bizarre lies about his work, claiming he was being groomed for the top job. He was effectively playing 3 roles: the loyal executive, the FBI informant, and the secret thief. and he was playing them all simultaneously in a state of high-functioning mania. The tension reached its peak in 1994 as the cartel meetings became more frequent and more brazen. The executives were no longer just fixing the price of lysine, they were fixing the price of citric acid and corn syrup. The conspiracy was expanding. And Mark Whitaker, the man with the wire taped to his chest, was right in the middle of it, recording every word while his own mind slowly unraveled. As 1994 progressed, the FBI's investigation, codenamed Harvest King, deepened into a labyrinth of corporate espionage that was as surreal as it was dangerous. Mark Whitaker, now fully immersed in his role as Agent 007, became the single most productive informant in the history of white-collar crime. He recorded hundreds of hours of conversations, capturing the voices of the world's most powerful agricultural executives as they casually dismantled the free market. But the recordings also captured the sound of a man losing his grip on reality. Whitaker's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began to view the FBI agents, Brian Shepard and his team, not as law enforcement handlers, but as his personal staff. He demanded they intervene in company politics. He bragged to his wife that the FBI was going to make him the next CEO of ADM once the Andreas family was arrested. This delusion that he could betray his bosses and inherit their kingdom simultaneously became the central pillar of his mania. Meanwhile, the cartel meetings moved to more exotic locations. In Hawaii, the executives met on a golf course, believing the open air would protect them from bugs. Whitaker, wired for sound, recorded them dividing up the global market share down to the ton. In Atlanta, at a meeting of the Corn Refiners Association, he captured Terry Wilson explaining how to discipline the market by punishing any company that oversold its quota. But the crown jewel of the investigation was a meeting in Decatur itself. The FBI, growing bolder, decided to plant hidden video cameras inside the very heart of the fortress. They targeted the office of Mick Andreas. This was a high-risk operation. FBI technicians posing as carpet cleaners infiltrated the ADM headquarters at night. They installed tiny cameras in the light fixtures and microphones in the lamps. For weeks, the FBI watched and listened as Mick Andreas, the heir apparent, conducted the business of the cartel from his own desk. The videotapes were devastating. They showed Mick Andreas, relaxed and arrogant, laughing as he discussed price hikes. They captured him saying things that no defense lawyer could ever explain away. In one infamous clip, he told his competitors, "The customer is our enemy." He explained that the goal wasn't just to make a profit. It was to take as much money as possible from the buyers, the farmers, the food companies, the public, without getting caught. These recordings were the smoking gun. They proved intent. They proved that the conspiracy went to the very top of the dynasty. Dwayne Andreas, the patriarch, was careful never to be recorded directly discussing the fix, but the tapes made it clear that Mick was acting with his father's full authority. The supermarket to the world was being run like a crime family. But while the FBI was celebrating its intelligence coup, Mark Whitaker was unraveling. The stress of the double life was triggering a severe manic episode. He stopped sleeping. He began to make wild, impulsive decisions. And, most dangerously, he accelerated his theft. Whitaker's embezzlement scheme, which had started as a small side hustle, had ballooned into a massive fraud. He was now moving millions of dollars through his shell companies in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. He justified this to himself with a twisted logic. He was underpaid compared to the Andreas family. And besides, he was a hero working for the government. He convinced himself that the FBI would overlook his bonus because he was delivering the case of the century. He began to drop hints to the agents. He made strange comments about off-the-books compensation. But the FBI, focused entirely on the price-fixing case, missed the warning signs. They didn't look at his bank accounts. They didn't realize that their star witness was committing a felony every time he signed a check. By early 1995, the FBI had enough. They had the tapes, the videos, and the testimony. It was time to take down the dynasty. They planned a massive, coordinated raid that would decapitate ADM in a single night. On the evening of June 27, 1995, FBI agents fanned out across Decatur. They arrived at the homes of Mick Andreas, Terry Wilson, and other executives. They served subpoenas. They seized documents. It was a shock and awe operation. The Andreas family, secure in their fortress for decades, was stunned. They couldn't believe the government would dare to touch them. Simultaneously, agents raided the ADM headquarters. They carted away boxes of files and hard drives. The news broke the next morning. FBI raids ADM in price-fixing probe. The stock price crashed. The world's agricultural markets were thrown into chaos. For Mark Whitaker, this was supposed to be his moment of triumph. He expected to be hailed as a hero, the brave whistleblower who had exposed the corruption. He waited for the call from the board of directors offering him the CEO job. Instead, he got a call from his lawyer. The FBI had finally looked at his finances. They had found the shell companies. They had found the stolen millions. The double cross was about to be revealed. The man who had betrayed the Andreas family had also betrayed the FBI. The hero was a villain. And as the reality of his situation began to sink in, Mark Whitaker's mind finally snapped. He wasn't going to be the CEO. He was going to be a defendant. The mole in the boardroom was about to become the prisoner in the garage. In the chaotic, sun-drenched days following the June 27, 1995 raid, the fortress of Archer Daniels Midland descended into a state of paranoia that rivaled the final days of the Nixon White House. The FBI had carted away hundreds of boxes of documents, but they had not made any arrests. They left the executives in a state of terrifying limbo, free to roam the hallways of the Decatur headquarters, wondering which one of them was the traitor. For Dwayne and Mick Andreas, the raid was a psychological violation. They regarded ADM not as a public corporation, but as a family trust. The idea that someone inside their inner circle, someone who had broken bread at their table and flown on their jets, was wearing a wire was inconceivable. They initially suspected a rival company or a disgruntled lower-level employee. They did not suspect Mark Whitaker. Whitaker, in the immediate aftermath, played the role of the loyal soldier with a manic intensity. He showed up to work the next day. He attended crisis meetings. He assured Mick Andreas that he would take a bullet for the family, but privately, his delusions of grandeur were spiraling out of control. He told his FBI handlers that the board of directors was on the verge of firing the Andreas family and installing him, Mark Whitaker, as the new chairman. He believed he was days away from his coronation. But ADM had a countermove. They hired Williams and Connolly, one of the most feared law firms in Washington, D.C. The lawyers didn't care about the price-fixing allegations. They assumed those were true. Their job was to find the mole and destroy his credibility. They launched an internal investigation that was forensic and ruthless. They combed through phone logs, expense reports, and bank transfers. It didn't take long. In early August 1995, the ADM auditors found the anomaly. It wasn't a wiretap, it was a check. They discovered a series of payments totaling $2.5 million made to a nebulous entity in Switzerland called Nord Biochem. The invoices were signed by Mark Whitaker. When they checked the vendor, it didn't exist. The money had gone straight into Whitaker's personal account. The realization hit the Andreas family with the force of a physical blow. The traitor was not a stranger. It was their golden boy. The man they had groomed, the man they had loved, was not only a spy, he was a thief. On August 7th, 1995, Mark Whitaker was summoned to a meeting with the company's lawyers. He thought he was there to discuss legal strategy. Instead, he was confronted with the evidence of his fraud. He was fired on the spot. He was stripped of his company car, his stock options, and his access to the building. He was escorted out of the fortress by security guards, a humiliated exile. But the true catastrophe was happening at the FBI office. When Whitaker called Agent Brian Shepard to tell him he had been fired, he dropped a bombshell that destroyed the government's entire case strategy. He admitted casually that he had indeed taken the money. It was just a bonus, Whitaker insisted. It was part of the culture. Mick told me to pay myself. Shepard was horrified. He realized in that moment that his star witness, the man on whom the entire multi-billion-dollar antitrust case rested, was a felon. Whitaker had been embezzling money while he was working for the FBI. He had committed crimes while wearing a wire. This destroyed Whitaker's credibility as a witness. No jury would believe a man who stole millions while pretending to be a hero. The White Knight narrative was dead. The FBI had been played. They had spent 3 years building a case against the Andreas family, only to find that their own camera lens was dirty. The fix was indeed in, but it had mutated into a double cross of epic proportions. As 1995 drew to a close, the battle lines shifted. It was no longer just the U.S. government versus ADM. It was now a three-way war. The government versus ADM versus Mark Whitaker. The Andreas family, wounded and vengeful, decided to turn the tables. They would use Whitaker's theft to distract from their own price fixing. They would paint the entire FBI investigation as a witch hunt led by a deranged bipolar thief. Mark Whitaker, fired, exposed, and facing prosecution from the very government he had served, retreated to his estate. The mania that had fueled him for 3 years began to crash into a deep suicidal depression. The tape recorder was off. The silence was deafening. And the mole in the boardroom realized he was trapped in a cage of his own design. The rise of the corruption was over. The fall of the man was about to begin. Can you be a whistleblower and a thief? Following his expulsion from the ADM fortress, Whitaker did not retreat into shame. He retreated into delusion. While the FBI and prosecutors stared in horror at bank records showing nearly $10 million in stolen funds, Whitaker sat in his estate, convinced this was merely a misunderstanding. He clung to a fantastical narrative that he was still the hero, and his theft was merely a corporate bonus, sanctioned by the very culture he was exposing. But the Department of Justice faced a nightmare scenario. Their star witness was now their biggest liability. ADM's lawyers would tear him apart on the stand. They would paint him not as a whistleblower, but as a criminal who invented the price-fixing story to cover up his own fraud. The Department of Justice faced a nightmare scenario. They had spent 3 years and millions of dollars investigating the largest price-fixing conspiracy in history, and now their entire case was resting on the shoulders of a felon. The prosecutors made a cold strategic decision. They had to cut Whitaker loose. They revoked his immunity agreement. They told him in no uncertain terms that he was no longer an agent of the government. He was a target. This rejection shattered Whitaker's fragile psychological state. He had built his entire identity around the fantasy of being Agent 007. Without the FBI's protection, he was just a fired executive who had stolen $9 million. The mania that had fueled him for years began to curdle into a deep, paranoid psychosis. He retreated to his estate, but he did not go quietly. In late 1995, Whitaker launched a one-man war against reality. He began to call journalists. He gave erratic, rambling interviews to the Wall Street Journal and Fortune magazine. He claimed that the FBI had ordered him to destroy tapes. He claimed that Agent Shepard had hit him. He spun wild, contradictory tales, trying to control the narrative as it slipped through his fingers. The FBI, terrified that Whitaker would destroy the case by talking to the press, tried to rein him in. But Whitaker was beyond control. He had begun to record his own conversations with his handlers. He taped Agent Shepard. He taped his own lawyers. He believed he was gathering insurance, but in reality he was documenting his own descent into madness. As 1995 drew to a close, the double cross was complete. Mark Whitaker had betrayed ADM to the FBI, and then he had betrayed the FBI to his own greed. Now he was alone, trapped between the vengeance of a billionaire dynasty and the cold machinery of the federal government. The hero was dead. The defendant was born. As the year turned to 1996, the full weight of the Andreas family's vengeance descended upon Mark Whitaker. The dynasty, humiliated by the FBI raid and the exposure of their price-fixing cartel, decided that the best defense was a total, scorched earth offense against their accuser. They hired Williams and Connolly, a legendary Washington law firm known for its aggressive litigation tactics. Their mission was simple: autopsy Mark Whitaker's life and find every cancer. The lawyers unleashed a team of forensic accountants who dug deeper into Whitaker's finances than the FBI ever had. What they found was not just embezzlement, it was a chronicle of pathological spending that bordered on the absurd. The initial estimate of $2.5 million in theft, which had gotten Whitaker fired, turned out to be a gross undercount. The true figure was staggering: $9.5 million. Whitaker had stolen nearly $10 million in just 3 years, and he hadn't just spent it on lifestyle. He had squandered it on delusions. The accountants found receipts for multiple luxury cars, Porsches, Ferraris, BMWs, some of which he had barely driven. He had built a massive indoor horse arena on his estate for his daughter, larger than most commercial facilities. He had donated large sums to his church, playing the role of the benevolent philanthropist with stolen money. But the most bizarre discovery was the Nigerian scam. The investigators found a series of wire transfers totaling millions of dollars sent to bank accounts in Nigeria. It turned out that Mark Whitaker, the brilliant PhD biochemist and corporate president, had fallen for a classic advance fee fraud. He had received letters promising him a share of a non-existent African fortune if he would just advance some legal fees. Whitaker had taken the money he stole from ADM, money he risked prison to embezzle, and handed it over to con artists in Lagos. When this detail was leaked to the press by ADM's lawyers, it destroyed the last shred of Whitaker's credibility. It painted him not as a mastermind, but as a gullible fool, a man whose judgment was so impaired that he couldn't distinguish a scam from a business deal. The narrative shifted. Whitaker wasn't a whistleblower. He was a clown. For Mick Andreas, watching from the besieged headquarters in Decatur, this was vindication. The discovery of the fraud allowed ADM to reframe the entire narrative. They argued to the Department of Justice that the price-fixing tapes were unreliable because they were made by a pathological liar who was trying to distract from his own crimes. They claimed that Whitaker had entrapped them, that he had instigated the price-fixing talk to please his FBI handlers. Inside the Whitaker home, the atmosphere was apocalyptic. Ginger Whitaker, Mark's wife, watched helplessly as her husband disintegrated. She had stood by him through the stress of the wire wearing, believing he was doing the right thing. Now she learned that he had lied to her about the money, about the bonuses, about everything. Mark was no longer sleeping. He paced the house at all hours. His speech was rapid fire and disjointed. He was oscillating between euphoria, convinced he would still be CEO, and deep, dark paranoia. He told Ginger that the FBI was tapping their phones, which they likely were, and that ADM had hired hitmen to kill them. He began to carry a gun. The double cross had entered a new, more dangerous phase. Whitaker was no longer just fighting the government. He was fighting his own mind. And as the pressure mounted, he decided to turn his recording device on the only people left who were talking to him, the FBI agents themselves. By the summer of 1996, the dynamic between Mark Whitaker and the FBI had mutated from a partnership into a psychological thriller. Trapped in his estate, besieged by lawyers, and consumed by untreated bipolar mania, Whitaker convinced himself that his handlers were now his enemies. He believed that Agent Brian Shepard, the man who had protected him, coached him, and stood by him for 3 years, was conspiring with ADM to destroy him. In a twist of irony that would be laughable if it weren't so tragic, Whitaker decided to use the very tradecraft the FBI had taught him against the Bureau itself. He began to wear a wire to his meetings with the FBI. He concealed a micro-cassette recorder in his pocket during debriefings. He tried to bait Agent Shepard into admitting misconduct. He would ramble, making bizarre, leading statements like, "You guys knew about the Nord Biochem money, right? You told me it was okay to take the bonus, right?" He was trying to manufacture evidence to support his new delusional defense theory that the FBI had authorized his embezzlement as part of his cover story. But Shepard, a veteran agent with a rigid moral compass, didn't take the bait. He repeatedly told Whitaker to stop lying. When Whitaker later leaked these tapes to the press, hoping to expose the FBI, the plan backfired spectacularly. The recordings didn't show a corrupt FBI. They showed a patient, exhausted agent trying to reason with a man who was clearly losing his mind. The Department of Justice prosecutors, watching this spectacle, realized they were facing a catastrophe. Their star witness was actively trying to blackmail them. They had a decision to make. If they put Whitaker on the stand against the Andreas family, the defense attorneys would destroy him. They would play the tapes. They would show the Nigerian scams. They would paint the entire price-fixing investigation as the fantasy of a thief. To save the case against the supermarket to the world, the prosecutors realized they had to destroy the mole. They had to prosecute Mark Whitaker first. They had to prove to the jury that the government did not condone his theft and that the price-fixing evidence existed independently of Whitaker's credibility. In late 1996, the U.S. Attorney's Office made the unprecedented move. They indicted their own informant. Mark Whitaker was charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. The indictment listed the millions he had stolen, the shell companies, and the luxury cars. It was a scorched earth document. The government was effectively saying, "This man is a criminal, and we are going to put him in prison." For Whitaker, this was the final psychological break. The fantasy of the White Knight CEO was gone. The delusion that he was a hero was gone. He was facing decades in federal prison. The manic energy that had sustained him for 4 years suddenly evaporated, replaced by a crushing black depression. His world contracted to the size of his garage. One afternoon, overwhelmed by the shame and the terrifying reality of his situation, Mark Whitaker went into his garage. He closed the door, he got into his car and started the engine. He sat there breathing in the exhaust, waiting for the darkness to take him. He wanted to stop the noise in his head. He wanted to stop the lawyers, the agents, and the disappointment in his wife's eyes. It was his gardener who found him. The man noticed the engine noise and the fumes. He broke into the garage, dragged the unconscious executive out of the car, and saved his life. Mark Whitaker survived the suicide attempt, but his freedom was over. He was hospitalized, diagnosed, finally, with bipolar disorder, and placed on medication. But the legal machine he had set in motion could not be stopped by a diagnosis. The Andreas family was still free, armed with the best lawyers money could buy, and the government, embarrassed and angry, was preparing to make Mark Whitaker the first casualty of the war he had started. The double cross had ended in a garage filled with carbon monoxide. Now, the suicide attempt would transition into the slow, grinding death of a prison sentence. The failed suicide attempt in late 1996 marked the nadir of Mark Whitaker's psychological collapse, but it did not halt the grinding machinery of the federal justice system. As Whitaker was stabilized in a hospital, finally receiving the diagnosis of bipolar disorder that explained his erratic, high-stakes behavior, the prosecutors at the Department of Justice were finalizing their battle plan. They had made the cold calculation that to convict the Andreas dynasty, they first had to sacrifice their own pawn. They needed to show the jury that they were not protecting a criminal, even if that criminal had worn a wire for them for 3 years. In October 1997, Mark Whitaker stood before a federal judge. The man who had once envisioned himself as the next CEO of Archer Daniels Midland, the 007 of the Corn Belt, pleaded guilty to 37 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. He admitted to stealing $9.5 million from the company. The sentencing was brutal. The judge, unswayed by arguments about his mental health or his cooperation in the price-fixing case, handed down a sentence of 9 years in federal prison. It was a staggering punishment. For context, the average sentence for violent assault at the time was often less. Whitaker was going to prison for nearly a decade, 3 times longer than the sentence his bosses, the architects of the global price-fixing scheme, would eventually receive. The irony was absolute. The whistleblower was going to jail, while the targets of his whistleblowing were still free, fighting their case with a phalanx of high-priced lawyers. With Whitaker safely behind bars and his credibility shredded, the Department of Justice finally turned its guns on the main target, Archer Daniels Midland. But without their star witness on the stand, the government's case was weakened. They couldn't risk a trial where the defense would play the Whitaker tapes and paint the entire investigation as the fantasy of a madman. So, they cut a deal. In October 1996, ADM agreed to plead guilty to price-fixing charges. The company agreed to pay a fine of $100 million. At the time, it was the largest antitrust fine in history, a headline-grabbing number that allowed the DOJ to claim victory. But to the Andreas family, $100 million was a rounding error. It was less than the profit they had made from the lysine conspiracy in a single year. The fine was a cost of doing business, a tax on theft. The dynasty had survived. The company was intact. However, the government demanded one more thing: the heads of the executives. They refused to grant immunity to Mick Andreas and Terry Wilson. In 1998, the trial of the Soybean King's son began. It was the final showdown. But Mark Whitaker was not there. He was in a prison cell. The jury heard his voice on the tapes, nervous, eager, and incriminating, but they never saw his face. The tapes, despite the defense's attempts to discredit them, were too damning. The recordings of Mick Andreas laughing about stealing from customers, joking about the FBI, and dividing up the global market were irrefutable. In 1999, the jury returned a verdict. Mick Andreas and Terry Wilson were found guilty of fixing the price of lysine. The sentence was a shock to the corporate world. Mick Andreas was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. It was a victory for the government, but a strange one. The prince of the dynasty was going to jail for 3 years for stealing hundreds of millions from the global economy. The informant was going to jail for 9 years for stealing $9 million from the company. The scales of justice seemed tipped in favor of the powerful. The double-cross era ended with a tableau of devastation. The Andreas dynasty was decapitated. Mick's career was over, and Dwayne Andreas, the patriarch, was forced to step down, his legacy permanently stained. The Whitaker family was destroyed. Mark was in prison, his assets were seized, and his wife Ginger was left to raise their children alone, stigmatized by a community that viewed her husband as a traitor. The FBI got its conviction, but at the cost of its integrity. They had been outsmarted by a bipolar executive who played them for fools. The case of United States v. Andreas became a cautionary tale in the halls of the DOJ, a lesson in the dangers of relying on a source who is smarter and crazier than the agents running him. As the prison doors clanged shut on both the heir and the spy, the supermarket to the world moved on. ADM hired a new CEO, paid its fine, and continued to process the world's corn. But the ghosts of the fix remain, haunting the boardrooms of Decatur, a reminder that in the high-stakes game of corporate crime, the most dangerous person in the room is not the FBI agent, but the man sitting next to you with a smile on his face and a wire on his chest. 9 years for the spy, 3 for the king. Mark Whitaker survived the carbon monoxide in his garage, but his life as a free man was over. The suicide attempt marked the final collapse of his 007 fantasy. In October 1997, the Golden Boy stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to 37 counts of fraud. The transition was violent in its absolute erasure of his identity. By 1998, he was no longer a corporate president. He was inmate number 07543-424 at the Federal Correctional Institution in Butner, North Carolina. But if Mark's suffering was confined to a cell, the suffering of his wife, Ginger Whitaker, was a public spectacle played out in the unforgiving arena of a small company town. Decatur, Illinois is not just a city, it is ADM. The company's smell, the heavy, sweet odor of processed corn, hangs over the streets. The company's money builds the schools and the parks. When Mark turned on the Andreas family, he didn't just betray a corporation, he betrayed the town. For Ginger, the aftermath of the sentencing was a daily siege. She was the wife of the rat. The community that had once fawned over her at country club dinners now treated her as a pariah. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors looked away in the grocery store. The social isolation was absolute. She was left alone to navigate the wreckage of a life that had been dynamited by her husband's mania and the government's indifference. The financial devastation was total. The Department of Justice and the ADM lawyers picked the carcass of the Whitaker estate clean. The government seized the assets purchased with the embezzled money, the cars, the house, the jewelry. Ginger was left with 3 children to raise and 0 income. She went from being the wife of a multimillionaire to a single mother facing destitution, forced to sell off personal belongings to keep the lights on. The FBI agents who had sat in her living room for 3 years, eating her food and promising to protect her family, were gone. They had gotten their tapes. They didn't care about the collateral damage. Ginger's struggle in 1998 was a quiet, heroic war against despair. She had to explain to her children why their father was gone. She had to explain why they were losing their home. She had to shield them from the vitriol of a town that hated their last name. She drove a beat-up car past the gates of the ADM fortress, where the men who had ordered the price-fixing, Mick Andreas and Terry Wilson, were still sitting in their executive offices, free and wealthy, fighting their appeals. The injustice was visceral. Mark, the man who blew the whistle, albeit with dirty hands, was rotting in a cell. Mick, the architect of the global theft, was still dining at the country club. Inside the prison, Mark's mental state fluctuated wildly. The bipolar disorder that had fueled his double life was now his only companion. In the darkness of his cell, he oscillated between deep suicidal depressions and frantic attempts to fix his situation. He wrote endless letters. He tried to restart his legal defense from inside the walls. He was haunted by the image of his suicide attempt in the garage, the carbon monoxide, the gardener breaking the window. He realized that he had survived the fumes only to die by inches in a cage. The suicide attempt was not just a singular event in 1996. It was the defining metaphor for his entire existence during these early prison years. Every day was a struggle to find a reason to stay alive. The only lifeline was Ginger. Despite the lies, the theft, and the humiliation he had brought upon her, Ginger Whitaker did not leave him. She became his anchor. She began the grueling routine that would define the next decade of her life, the long drive to the federal prison. She packed the kids into the car, driving hundreds of miles to sit in a bleak visitation room, talking to her husband through a pane of glass or across a crowded table. For the children, these visits were a trauma of their own. They saw their father not as the vibrant, successful man who played ball with them, but as a diminished, frightened figure in a khaki jumpsuit. They saw the guards strip search him. They absorbed the shame of the prison environment. The Scaife children had lost their father to greed. The Whitaker children lost theirs to the government. As 1998 drew to a close, the Whitaker family was effectively dead, killed by the collision of corporate vengeance and federal prosecution. But the story wasn't over. The trial of the real criminals, the Andreas family, was about to begin in Chicago, and Mark Whitaker, sitting in his cell, was about to watch his former masters finally face the music, knowing that he, the man who made it possible, would not be there to see it. As Mark Whitaker began his sentence in 1998, the legal focus shifted to the men he had betrayed. In September 1998, the criminal trial of Mick Andreas and Terry Wilson finally began in a federal courtroom in Chicago. It was the climax of the Harvest King investigation, but the star of the show was absent. Mark Whitaker was not called to the stand. The prosecutors, terrified that his bipolar delusions and embezzlement conviction would destroy their case, decided to leave him in his cell. Instead, they relied on his ghost, the hundreds of hours of secret recordings he had made while wearing the wire. For 2 months, the jury listened to the tapes. They heard the voices of the Andreas dynasty, unfiltered and arrogant. They heard Mick Andreas laughing about stealing from customers. They heard Terry Wilson explaining the mechanics of the global cartel. The recordings were devastating. They painted a portrait of a corporate culture so morally bankrupt that it viewed price fixing not as a crime, but as a sport. In September 1999, the verdict was delivered. Mick Andreas and Terry Wilson were found guilty of conspiracy to fix prices. The sentencing, however, was a study in the inequalities of American justice. Mick Andreas, the heir to the empire, the man who had orchestrated a scheme that stole hundreds of millions of dollars from consumers worldwide, was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Mark Whitaker, the man who had exposed the scheme, was serving 9 years. For Mark, watching the news from the prison rec room, this disparity was a crushing psychological blow. He had risked his life, his family, and his sanity to help the government, and his reward was a sentence 3 times longer than the ringleaders. It reinforced his paranoid belief that the system was rigged, that the Andreas family's power could bend even the arc of justice. But the suffering of the prince was real in its own way. Mick Andreas entered the federal prison system in 1999. For a man raised in the hermetic luxury of Decatur, who had never known a day without servants or private jets, prison was a humiliation. He was stripped of his power, his name, and his dignity. The Prince of Decatur was now just another inmate, yet even in prison the disparity remained. Mick had the support of his family's billions. His lawyers fought his appeals. His wife and children were insulated by trust funds. He knew that when he got out, he would still be rich. Mark Whitaker had no such comfort. His mind, unmoored by the injustice, continued to fracture. He became obsessed with his own case. He wrote letters to judges, to the FBI, to the media, spinning new theories about his innocence. He claimed his embezzlement was actually a covert bonus scheme authorized by the CIA. These delusions, fueled by his untreated bipolar disorder, alienated the few supporters he had left. Back in Decatur, the Andreas family moved to erase the past. Dwayne Andreas, the patriarch, stepped down as CEO in 1997 and as chairman in 1999. The board, desperate to save the company's reputation, brought in an outsider, G. Allen Andreas, to lead. They wanted to wash the Andreas name clean of the stain of price fixing. But the stain was indelible. The supermarket to the world was now known as the supermarket to the cartel. The year 1999 ended with a stark tableau. The 2 men who had once sat side by side in the boardroom, plotting global domination, were now sitting in separate federal prisons. One was a billionaire, serving a short sentence for greed. The other was a broken whistleblower, serving a long sentence for madness. The dynasty had fallen, but the wreckage had landed squarely on the head of the man who tried to bring it down. As the new millennium dawned, the drama of the ADM scandal shifted from the courtroom to the visitation room. The years 2000 to 2002 were the darkest period for the Whitaker family, a grinding war of attrition fought not with legal briefs, but with miles on an odometer and hours on a prison clock. Ginger Whitaker became the sole pillar of a collapsing structure. While her husband was incarcerated in a series of federal prisons, moving from North Carolina to Kentucky to South Carolina, she was left to manage the impossible logistics of raising 3 children alone on a shattered budget, with a husband who was often unreachable and mentally unstable. The visitation ritual became the defining rhythm of their lives. Every weekend, or as often as they could afford, Ginger would pack the children into the car for drives that lasted 6, 8, or 10 hours. They would stay in cheap motels near the prison. They would stand in line for security checks, subjected to the indignity of pat-downs and metal detectors. And then they would sit in a sterile room, talking to Mark through a plexiglass barrier or across a crowded table under the watchful eyes of guards. For the children, this was a slow-motion trauma. They were growing up in the shadow of their father's absence. They saw him age. They saw the light go out of his eyes. Mark missed graduations, birthdays, and the quiet, formative moments of adolescence. He was a voice on a monitored phone line, a face in a photograph. The golden boy who had promised them the world had left them with nothing but a prison ID number. Mark's mental state during this period remained fragile. He was still fighting his own case in his head, writing letters, obsessing over legal theories. He felt forgotten. The FBI agents who had used him were gone, promoted, or retired. The prosecutors had moved on to other cases. He was just another inmate in the vast American prison industrial complex. But outside the walls, the Andreas dynasty was experiencing a very different kind of punishment. Mick Andreas was released from prison in 2002. Having served less than 3 years, he returned to Decatur not as a pariah but as a wealthy private citizen. He had lost his title, but he had kept his fortune. The Andreas family still owned millions of shares of ADM stock. Mick retreated to his estates, living a life of quiet luxury, insulated by his money. He never apologized. He never publicly acknowledged the damage he had done. To him, the prison term was just a bad business deal, a transaction completed. This disparity gnawed at Mark Whitaker. He watched from his cell as the man who had ordered the crimes walked free, while he, the man who exposed them, still had years left to serve. It was a bitterness that could have consumed him completely. But in 2003, something shifted. In the depths of his despair, Mark Whitaker found a new narrative. He stopped trying to be 007 and started trying to be a human being. With the help of a prison chaplain and the unwavering support of Ginger, he began to confront his bipolar disorder, not as a conspiracy but as an illness. He started taking his medication consistently. He began to read the Bible. He underwent a profound religious conversion. This was not a jailhouse hustle, it was a psychological restructuring. For the first time in a decade, the mania subsided. The delusions of grandeur faded. He realized that he was not a victim of the FBI or ADM. He was a victim of his own greed and his own broken chemistry. He accepted responsibility. As 2004 and 2005 passed, a new Mark Whitaker emerged. He became a model prisoner. He taught GED classes to other inmates. He mentored younger men. He began to rebuild his relationship with his children, not as a hero, but as a flawed father asking for forgiveness. Meanwhile, the world outside was forgetting him. Dwayne Andreas, the Godfather, was fading into senility and irrelevance. The ADM Corporation, under new management, was rebranding itself as a green energy giant, focusing on ethanol and sustainability, trying to wash away the stain of the price-fixing era. The supermarket to the world was moving on, leaving the wreckage of the 1990s in the rearview mirror. But for Ginger Whitaker, the war wasn't over. She was fighting for her husband's release. She petitioned the Department of Justice. She gathered letters of support from the FBI agents who had originally handled Mark, men who, despite the double cross, still felt a pang of guilt about the disparity in sentencing. They argued that without Mark, there would have been no case. They argued that 9 years was too long for a man who had worn a wire for 3 years. Finally, the system relented. As 2006 approached, Mark Whitaker received his release date. The long nightmare was ending. The suicide attempt in the garage had failed, but the man who walked out of that garage had died in prison. The man who was coming home was someone else entirely, a survivor, scarred and humbled, ready to step back into a world that had moved on without him. The final years of Mark Whitaker's imprisonment, 2003 to 2005, were a quiet revolution of the spirit amidst the wreckage of his former life. While the outside world continued to churn, the dot-com bubble bursting, the Iraq War beginning, Whitaker's universe had shrunk to the size of his cell and the circumference of his own conscience. The religious conversion he underwent was not a flash of lightning, but a slow, painful reconstruction of a shattered ego. He stopped blaming the FBI. He stopped blaming Mick Andreas. He started blaming himself. This shift was critical because it allowed him to survive the crushing envy that could have destroyed him. While he sat in a federal prison camp, he read about the continued prosperity of the Andreas dynasty. Although Dwayne Andreas had been forced into retirement, he remained a billionaire, a king in exile surrounded by his art collection and his political friends. Mick Andreas, released in 2002, had quietly resumed his life of privilege. He was no longer an executive, but he was still a remarkably wealthy man, attending charity galas and managing his investments. The contrast was galling. The man who ordered the crime was free and rich. The man who exposed the crime was imprisoned and broke. But Whitaker, aided by his faith and the letters from Ginger, learned to let go of the bitterness. He realized that his freedom would not come from a court order, but from an internal acceptance of his own flaws. However, the destruction of the Andreas dynasty was happening in slow motion. The scandal had permanently stained the family name. Dwayne Andreas, once the soybean king who advised presidents, was now remembered primarily as the father of a felon. His influence in Washington evaporated. The politicians who had once flocked to his Florida condo stopped calling. The ADM board, now dominated by outsiders, systematically dismantled the family's control. They brought in new CEOs with no connection to the Andreas bloodline. The era of the family business was over. The supermarket to the world had become a faceless corporation, eager to forget the men who built it. As 2006 approached, the legal machinery finally turned in Whitaker's favor. His good behavior, his teaching of other inmates, and the relentless advocacy of his wife and former FBI handlers had earned him a reduction in sentence. He had served 8.5 years, longer than almost any white-collar criminal in American history, for a first offense. On December the 22nd, 2006, the gates of the federal prison opened. Mark Whitaker walked out. He was 49 years old. He had missed his children's childhoods. His hair was gray. He had no money, no home, and a felony record that would follow him forever. But waiting for him in the parking lot, standing next to a modest sedan, was Ginger. She had waited for him for 9 years. She had raised their 3 children alone, fought off bankruptcy, and endured the scorn of her community. But she had not abandoned him. The reunion was not a Hollywood ending. There were no reporters, no book deals, no ticker tape parades. It was a quiet, tearful embrace in a prison parking lot. They drove away together, not to a mansion, but to a rented house. Mark Whitaker had lost his career, his reputation, and his fortune, but he had kept his family. And in the twisted moral calculus of the ADM scandal, that made him the only true winner. The release of Mark Whitaker in late 2006 was not a restoration. It was a resurrection. He emerged into a world that had fundamentally changed. The internet, which had barely existed when he went in, now dominated global commerce. The company he had betrayed, ADM, was no longer the personal fiefdom of the Andreas clan, but a modern, multinational conglomerate focused on ethanol and green energy, its dark past sanitized by new logos and PR campaigns. And the man himself was different. The manic, hyper-ambitious executive was gone, replaced by a quiet, devout man who carried the weight of a decade of lost time. But the most profound change was in the dynamic of the two families. The Whitaker family, though shattered financially, had survived intact emotionally. Ginger's loyalty had forged a bond that prison could not break. They had no money, but they had each other. The Andreas family, by contrast, had kept their money but lost their dynasty. Dwayne Andreas, the godfather, lived out his final years in a twilight of senility and irrelevance, watching his influence in Washington evaporate. He died in 2016 at the age of 98, a billionaire whose obituary was dominated by the crimes of his son. Mick Andreas, though released from prison years earlier, never returned to power. He lived a life of wealthy obscurity, permanently branded a felon. The company that bore their name had moved on without them. The supermarket to the world was still open for business, but the family that built it had been evicted from the store. The suicide attempt in the garage in 1996 had been a desperate act of a man trying to escape his own lies. 10 years later, Mark Whitaker realized that the true escape wasn't death, it was truth. He spent the next decade traveling the country, speaking to FBI agents and corporate executives about ethics, mental health, and the seduction of greed. He became a living cautionary tale, a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of stolen money and wiretaps. The informant saga ended not with a bang, but with a quiet realization. The FBI got its conviction, the Andreas family lost their throne, and Mark Whitaker lost his freedom. In the zero-sum game of corporate espionage, everyone lost. The only winner was the system itself, the relentless machinery of global agribusiness that continued to grind on, indifferent to the lives it consumed, fixing prices and feeding the world, one corrupt deal at a time, beyond the Hollywood joke. Mark Whitaker's release from prison in late 2006 was not the end of his ordeal. It was the beginning of a new, quieter form of punishment. He had paid his debt to society in years, but he was now tasked with paying his debt to his reputation in a world that had branded him a liar and a thief. The transition from inmate to citizen was brutal. He was a 49-year-old man with a PhD and a felony record, a combination that made him unemployable in the corporate world he had once dominated. He applied for jobs he was overqualified for, only to be rejected once the background check came back. The stigma of the informant was a scarlet letter that no amount of rehabilitation could erase. For 3 years, from 2007 to 2009, Whitaker lived in a professional purgatory. He worked entry-level jobs supported by his wife Ginger, who had become the family's breadwinner. The man who had once flown on private jets was now grateful for a paycheck that barely covered the rent. But the most painful blow was yet to come, and it would be delivered not by a judge, but by Hollywood. In 2009, the director Steven Soderbergh released the film The Informant, starring Matt Damon as Mark Whitaker. To the public, the movie was a dark comedy, a quirky, entertaining romp through the absurdity of corporate crime. Matt Damon played Whitaker as a bumbling, delusional, and somewhat lovable narcissist, narrating his own downfall with a cheerful, manic optimism. The film was a critical success, praised for its wit and its portrayal of the surreal nature of the ADM scandal. But to Mark Whitaker, watching his life unfold on the screen, the film was a devastation. It stripped his story of its tragedy and turned it into a farce. The movie focused heavily on his mania, his lies, and his bizarre behavior, playing them for laughs. It largely omitted the profound suffering of his family, the terror of the FBI investigation, and the crushing reality of his suicide attempt. The scene in the garage where he had tried to end his life was depicted, but the emotional weight of that moment, the despair of a broken man, was subsumed by the film's satirical tone. The movie cemented a public image of Whitaker that was impossible to shake, the clown prince of white-collar crime. It erased the fact that he had, despite his flaws, exposed a massive global conspiracy that was stealing from every consumer in the world. It made him a punchline. For the Whitaker family, the premiere was not a celebration. It was a public shaming, a reopening of wounds that had just begun to heal. They watched as audiences laughed at the very events that had destroyed their lives. However, the film's release also had an unintended consequence. It brought Mark Whitaker back into the public eye, and in doing so, it opened a door to redemption. A small biotech company, Cypress Systems, saw beyond the caricature. They saw a brilliant scientist who had made terrible mistakes but had paid a heavy price. In 2009, they took a chance and hired him. This was the turning point. Whitaker threw himself into his new role with the same intensity he had once brought to ADM, but this time it was tempered by humility and a rigorous adherence to ethics. He rose quickly through the ranks, eventually becoming the chief operating officer. He became a fixture on the speaking circuit, traveling the country to talk to FBI agents, corporate boards, and business students. But his message was not about corporate strategy. It was about the fraud triangle: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. He used his own life as a case study in how good people can do bad things. He spoke openly about his bipolar disorder, his greed, and the seduction of power. He became a living warning label for the corporate world. While Whitaker was rebuilding his life brick by brick, the Andreas dynasty was fading into the twilight of history. The death of Dwayne Andreas in 2016 marked the definitive end of an era. He died at the age of 98, a billionaire recluse whose obituary was dominated not by his political friendships or his philanthropy, but by the price-fixing scandal his son had overseen. The soybean king was buried with his secrets, his legacy permanently stained by the tapes his adopted son had recorded. Mick Andreas, the heir who had gone to prison, lived out his remaining years in a strange, wealthy silence. He never returned to public life. He never gave interviews. He became a ghost in the town his family had ruled. The supermarket to the world had moved on, led by professional CEOs with no connection to the founding families. The fortress in Decatur was still there, churning out corn syrup and ethanol, but the throne room was empty. By 2018, the aftermath had settled into a quiet equilibrium. Mark Whitaker was a grandfather, a respected executive, and a man who had found peace in his faith and his family. But the scars remained. He knew that he would never fully escape the shadow of the informant. He knew that every time he walked into a room, people were wondering if he was wearing a wire. He had survived the suicide attempt, the prison cell, and the Hollywood ridicule, but he had paid for his survival with his anonymity. He was the man who knew too much, the spy who came in from the cold and found that the world had changed, but the distrust he had helped create would last forever. As the narrative of Mark Whitaker and the Andreas dynasty reached its conclusion in the modern day, the shadow cast by the scandal stretched far beyond the personal lives of the protagonists. The Lysine conspiracy had fundamentally altered the landscape of global business, leaving behind a legacy of permanent distrust. The tapes recorded by Whitaker in the early 1990s had peeled back the curtain on the polite fiction of the free market, revealing a world where competition was a charade and collusion was the norm. This revelation did not just change the law, it changed the culture. In the years following the scandal, corporate compliance became a multi-billion-dollar industry. Antitrust training became mandatory in boardrooms from Tokyo to London. Executives learned, often citing the ADM case as a cautionary tale, that every meeting, every phone call, and every handshake could be evidence. The era of the gentleman's agreement in a smoky hotel room was over, replaced by an era of legal paranoia, where lawyers sat in every meeting. But the cynicism remained. The public, having seen how easily the supermarket to the world could rig the price of food, never fully regained its trust in the food supply chain. When prices for eggs, milk, or bread spiked in the 2020s, the whisper of price fixing was never far away. The ghost of Mick Andreas laughing on a hidden camera about stealing from customers had become the permanent avatar of corporate greed. For Mark Whitaker, the final act of his life has been one of quiet redemption. Now in his 60s, he serves as a senior executive at a biotech firm, but his true vocation is his testimony. He speaks to FBI academies, law schools, and business conferences, telling the unvarnished story of his mania and his crimes. He does not paint himself as a victim anymore. He tells audiences that he was a man who lost his moral compass in the pursuit of approval and wealth. He speaks of the fraud triangle, pressure, opportunity, and rationalization, not as an academic concept, but as the blueprint of his own destruction. His relationship with Ginger remains the emotional anchor of his story. They are still married, a testament to a loyalty that survived the FBI, the embezzlement, the suicide attempt, and the prison sentence. They live a quiet life, far removed from the jets and the mansions of the ADM days. They are the survivors of a shipwreck, grateful simply to be on dry land. The Andreas family, however, has faded into the background of American history. The name that once adorned buildings and foundations has lost its luster. The dynasty that Dwayne Andreas built to last 1,000 years collapsed in a single generation, destroyed not by market forces, but by the hubris of its patriarch and the criminality of its heir. The fortress in Decatur still stands, humming with industry, but the family that built it has been evicted, their legacy reduced to a case study in business ethics textbooks. The ultimate lesson of the ADM scandal is a grim one. It proved that in the high-stakes world of global capitalism, the line between a CEO and a criminal is often just a matter of who is wearing the wire. It demonstrated that loyalty to a corporate family can be a form of moral suicide. And it showed that while you can fix prices, you can buy politicians, and you can fool the FBI for a while, you cannot escape the consequences of your own mind. In the end, the tragedy was not just Whitaker's, it was the total collapse of an American monarchy. The Andreas dynasty, which had ruled agriculture like feudal lords from their fortress in Decatur, was dismantled. Dwayne Andreas died watching his influence evaporate, and Mick Andreas lived out his days in the shadow of a felony conviction. The supermarket to the world remains open, but the family that built it has been evicted from history. Mark Whitaker, the man who nurtured a destroyer within their walls, was left with nothing but the truth. In the game of empires, when you play with the devil, everyone loses.